Good evening, everybody. This is Roger Williams, and welcome to History Author Talks. I'm glad that you could join us this evening. We have a wonderful show, a wonderful program in store for you, a little bit different than what we've been doing in the past. And at the end of the show, I will be telling you about some of our other programs coming up. As we enter into this holiday season, I am preparing for what I call the 10 crucial days, what historians call the 10 crucial days, which are the anniversaries of the campaigns of the battles of Trenton and Princeton. The iconic Emanuel Leutze painting of Washington crossing the Delaware happened on the night of December 25th, 26th, 1776. And my partner, Larry Kidder, and I give bus tours for the 10 crucial days. These are day-long tours that visit Washington Crossing and the sites of the battles of Trenton and Princeton. So if you'd like to learn more about that, you can just go to 10crucialdays.org and you can learn more about the 10 Crucial Days bus tours. Traversing the 10 Crucial Days, we call it. So tonight, I am very pleased to bring to our program an author who I've been working with for quite a while. He's written a number of really wonderful books. Rob Skeed is the author of Something to Prove and several middle grade humor tales, including Elves Can't Dunk. The series that he's going to be talking about tonight is the American Revolutionary War adventure series. And he's going to tell us about his three books. These are books for middle grade readers on the American Revolution. You're going to learn a lot about some historical fact and how Rob has managed to put these into adventure stories for kids. So we want to hear about these stories. But after, we're going to ask Rob some questions about not only the writing process, but also about how we teach kids history these days. This is in the headlines. It's good to have an author who is very familiar, he goes to a lot of schools, or at least pre-COVID, he went to a lot of schools. I'm sure he'll be going to a lot of other schools as we move forward. And we're going to learn about teaching kids about the American Revolutionary War period. So with that, I also just wanted to mention, if you have questions for Rob as we move through the program, you can use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. And you can send questions to me, and I will try and fit them in at the end of the show. So with that, I'm going to now turn it over to Robert Skeed.
All right, great. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our broadcast tonight. Can everybody see my screen? Give a thumbs up if you can.
Yeah.
All right. So as Roger just said, my name is Robert Skeed. On behalf of my father, who's the good-looking guy you see here on the right with a full head of hair, even at age 95, I want to thank you for joining us. I also want to thank Roger for, one, being a great patriot, two, being a champion of our stories, and three, for inviting me to this History Author Talk presentation tonight to be your host. My dad and I are a father-son writing team. And we have written 3 American Revolutionary War adventures. And you can see them right here: Patriots, Redcoats, and Spies, Submarine, Secrets, and a Daring Rescue, and Links to Liberty, Defending the Great Chain at West Point. So you can expect from my presentation today is I'm going to tell you a little bit about these stories, how they came to be, and the creative hooks behind each story, because there was a reason for each story. And we wanted to take little known facts and examples of amazing creativity during the American Revolution and use those as hooks to draw readers in, readers being patriots ages 9 and up, so they can get inspired to do great things and nurture their patriotism and learn things that most of us didn't learn. about the American Revolution in our classrooms. I am 57 years old, and I was in 6th grade in 1976 during the bicentennial. And I never learned about Culper spies or American Turtle Submarine or the Great Chain at West Point. And I was also a huge fan of the American Revolution during the bicentennial. But had I learned about the things like that, I probably would have been even more enamored with that period of our American history. So there's me. I actually went back in time in my DeLorean. I was accosted by a redcoat who tried to confiscate my book, Patriots, Redcoats, and Spies. And and I captured him. And today we're going to learn about amazing creativity during the American Revolution, and specifically, using those feats of creativity to inspire kids to want to learn more. So my dad and I, as I said earlier, wrote these 3 history books together, and they're historical fiction. And this is the place where it all began. This is the Van Allen House in Oakland, New Jersey, where George Washington stayed for 2 days, July 14th and 15th in 1777. And my family and I, wife and kids, visited this house years ago. And it was there that I got an idea for a story. But I never wrote it until years later. And interesting thing was, when I went to this blue marker, and I saw that the date that Washington was there, and it was the same day that I was there 200 plus years into the future. So at that time, I thought that was pretty cool, but I didn't know it might have some kind of prophetic meaning in my life. And this is the cover of Patriots, Redcoats, and Spies. And the way this came about was my dad did our genealogy. He and my sister had been working on our genealogy for years. They discovered that we had a relative, actually several, who served or fought in the American Revolution. And my dad joined the Sons of the American Revolution, and he got his certificate. And my dad said to me, hey, you should become a member of this organization too. I've got the number and you can just apply. So I said, that's cool, Dad. And I said, hey, by the way, I had an American Revolution story idea when I visited the Van Allen House years ago. And so I gave my dad that 30-second nugget of a summary of the story. And I thought that was the end of it. A few days later, I get an email from my dad, who was 84 at the time. And he took that little nugget of a story and he did a complete treatment. So he wrote basically a beginning, middle, and end, had characters, had their conflict. And I read this and I said to myself, how did my dad do this? Like, I'm the writer in the family. And I was so impressed by what he had done that just for fun that night, I wrote the first scene of the story in book format. And then I emailed it to him. And then my dad, like any son, right? I couldn't wait for my dad to call me back and tell me what he thought about it. And he said, Rob, that's great. But then he said 2 words that scared me. He said, keep going. And that's what I did with my father, day after day, week after week. We did scene after scene, chapter after chapter. And over a period of time, my dad and I together wrote what became Patriots, Redcoats, and Spies. So my line is, you talk about a father-son fishing trip being a great bonding experience. Try writing a book or a few books with your dad. That's like a fishing trip on steroids. So Patriots, Redcoats, and Spies is the story of 2 twin boys. Their names are John and Ambrose Clark. They're the sons of Lamberton Clark, who is actually the name of our ancestor who served during the American Revolution in the Continental Army and the Connecticut Militia. And they find out that their dad is a courier spy for the Culper spy ring when he gets shot by 2 British redcoats. And the father is on the shores of Fairfield, Connecticut. He's got this secret spy letter he's got to get to General Washington. All he knows is he's somewhere in the Morristown vicinity area. And he has only 2 hopes of getting that secret message to General Washington. And that's his twin boys. The boys leave their father on the shores of Fairfield with no resources. And it's about all the bad things that go wrong, right? From point A to point B to point C. And what the boys don't know is that the 2 redcoats who shot their dad are hot on their trail. So that's a little bit about Patriots, Redcoats, and Spies. And there's my dad and I sporting our hats at the Van Allen House. So I like to think about the American Revolution this way, right? If and this is no surprise to anyone, if things worked out differently, we all might be speaking with British accents right now. But fortunately for us, that didn't happen. And being members of, residents of New Jersey, where I am, we can be very proud of the role our state played in the American Revolution. There were more than 296 engagements that occurred in New Jersey, and that is more clashes than any other colony during the Revolutionary War. So we should all be proud of the role our state played in the American Revolution and the birth of our nation. And when we talk about teaching kids about the American Revolution, I like to start out about some of the leadership traits that I learned about this great man, General Washington. Like many of you, I grew up with a photo of General Washington in my classroom. I'm sad to say that when I visit schools today, I rarely see a picture of General Washington in a classroom. But there were several great things I learned about Washington in the research that we did for this story. And that was the way he carried himself, his character, the words that he chose, the way that he even, you'll see the way that he even just his persona made everybody love and respect him. And here's some great quotes that I found out about General Washington. Here's John Adams said, his example is complete, and it will teach wisdom and virtue to magistrates, citizens, and men, not only in the present age, but in future generations. And I love how they talked back then too, and how they wrote, right? I love this quote, excuse me. The whole of his character was in its mass perfect, nothing bad, and a few points indifferent, and it may be truly said that never did nature and fortune combine more perfectly to make a man great and to place him in the same constellation with whatever worthies have merited from man an everlasting remembrance. Let me just go back here. Again, the quotes about General Washington speak so much about his character, and kids today have no idea about General Washington and who he was. And just sharing some quotes about him and how well respected is a great way to teach kids about the important role he played in our nation. As you may know, Washington also had this code of conduct, his rules of civility. Again, this is what in part drove his character and driving the respect he received from others. And by age 16, Washington copied by hand 110 rules of civility and decent behavior. And they're based on a set of rules composed by French Jesuits in 1595. And General Washington lived by these rules his entire life. And here's some of them just to give an example. Now imagine if everyone in our society did this today. This is a great thing to teach kids. Again, when I speak to schools, I always share this with them as well as part of my teaching about the American Revolution and General Washington. Every action done in company ought to be done with some sign of respect to those that are present. Speak not when others speak, sit not when others stand, speak not when you should hold your peace, and walk not when others stop. When you sit down, keep your feet firm and even, without putting one on the other or crossing them. Try doing that during a meeting. It's very difficult. Washington lived by this. Let your countenance be pleasant, but in serious matters somewhat grave. And show not yourself glad at the misfortune of another, though he were your enemy. And this last one, strive not with your superiors in argument, but always submit your judgment to others with modesty. Again, imagine if our youth lived this every day like General Washington did. Another great thing I love to tell kids as I teach the American Revolution is the story about Washington being bulletproof. This happened at the Battle of Manganella on July 9th in 1755. And I'm going to read the quote to you and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. This is from an Indian chief. He says, I am chief and ruler over my tribes. My influence extends to the waters of the Great Lakes and to the far blue mountains. I have traveled a long and weary path that I might see the young warrior, George Washington, from the day he had horses shot out from underneath him of the great battle. It was on the day when the white man's blood mixed with the streams of our forest, that I first beheld this chief. I called to my young men and said, mark yon tall and daring warrior. He is not of the Redcoat tribe. He hath Indian's wisdom, and his warriors fight as we do. Himself is alone exposed. Quick, let your aim be certain, and he dies. Our rifles were leveled, rifles which, but for him, knew not how to miss. 'Twas all in vain. A power mightier far than we, shielded him from harm. He cannot die in battle. I am old and soon shall be gathered to the great council fire of my fathers in the land of shades. But ere I go, there is something bids me speak in the voice of prophecy. Listen, the great spirit protects that man and guides his destinies. He'll become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty empire. So these were words spoken by an Indian chief on the border of Ohio and West Virginia to interpreter to George Washington and Dr. Craik, a close friend of Washington, 15 years after this battle happened. Again, it just goes to speak that the hand of Providence was protecting George Washington. Washington himself, in a letter to his brother, wrote this: but by the all-powerful dispensations of Providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation. For I had 4 bullet holes through my coat and 2 horses shot from underneath me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me. So I love this quote from Washington because he talks about how he himself understands that a power mightier than he was protecting him. So when you're writing a story and you have General Washington in it, right, you want to make sure you nail that character. And as my father and I wrote Patriots, Redcoats, and Spies, that was one of our biggest challenges. You can't get George Washington wrong. So what we did is we found letters that Washington had written during that time period in our story. And we used a lot of the dialogue in the story and massaged it a little bit so it sounded like, the way we speak today, but so that kids could have a feeling for this was really what George Washington, how he would speak. And I love this quote because it talks about how what I see as Washington being the first positive speaker or positive thinker. And he says that his position as before put him in a position of being in despair, but he has seen that has changed. And so he knows that it will change for the better in the future. That's essentially the paraphrase. And again, we use this in the story just so kids would have a true, positive quote from General Washington. Also, what I learned during research, which I'm sure Roger already knew this, was that George Washington had his own flag, which you could see here in this picture from Washington's Crossing. And it was called General Washington's Colors. You may be familiar with it. Those stars are in the logo of the Museum of the American Revolution. And that's one thing I learned that I did not know before. So this flag would have gone with Washington everywhere he traveled, even at the Van Allen House in Oakland, New Jersey, where I got the idea for the story. Another thing that I learned that I love to teach kids, again, we don't learn about this in school, was George Washington had lifeguards. Essentially, they were the beginnings of the Secret Service. Their purpose, was to protect General Washington, the money, and the official papers of the Continental Army. And the men had to be sober, intelligent, reliable, clean, and neat as a soldier should be, and about 5'8" to 5'10" in height. And Major Caleb Gibbs of Rhode Island was the first commander of the Guard. And I won't get too much into the cult perspiring, but again, this is nothing that you learn about in elementary school, where the American Revolution is mostly taught to kids. I never heard about it in 1976 or thereafter, but George Washington needed to know what the British troops were doing in the New York area. And so he created aspiring, and it was top secret. To be discovered meant certain death. One of the men charged with creating the aspiring was Ben Tallmadge. What I love telling kids as we teach about the American Revolution is, if you were charged with creating aspiring, what might you do? And maybe you would follow the ways of Ben Tallmadge. And what he did was he was from Setauket, Long Island, and he recruited his like-minded friends and to be the first members of the aspiring. And kids are fascinated with the fact that there were spies during the American Revolution. And so when you use that as a hook, you can really draw them into the greater story. So a little bit about Benjamin Tallmadge. And as my dad and I researched these stories, he quickly became my new favorite character of the American Revolution. And I found out he was the son of a preacher, a Yale classmate and close friend of American spy Nathan Hale. He enlisted in the Continental Army in the 2nd Continental Light Dragoons in Connecticut. He was a confident and trusted colleague of General Washington. He fought Tory bandits and raiders in Connecticut and had several key battles against the British. As I just mentioned, he was the secret leader of the Culper Spy Ring. His code name was John Bolton. And he was a leader of the raid on Fort St. George, which we actually used in our story, Submarine, Secrets, and a Daring Rescue. Unfortunately, his brother William was captured and died on a British prisoner of war ship. And most interestingly, he was involved in the transport and custody of Major John Andre, the British officer and spy who plotted with Benedict Arnold to capture West Point. In fact, he spent so much time with Andre while he was in custody, he grew to appreciate the man who was practically his equal on the British side. So, when you publish one book, as Roger knows, the publisher always asks, what's next? Fortunately, we also had our sequel to Patriots, Redcoats, and Spies in the works when we sold Patriots, Redcoats, and Spies. And in our what's next query, as we searched for what would be the hook, during a Google search, I saw this image. And I was like, what is that? And when I show this to kids, as we teach the American Revolution, they too wonder what it is. It looks like a giant acorn there, right? But then when I tell them that that is a submarine, in fact, it's the very first submarine invented for warfare, and it was invented during colonial times, and it worked. The kids are so fascinated, as you would be too, and as I was when I learned more about this. So that is the American Turtle submarine, which we used as the hook for Submarines, Secrets, and a Daring Rescue. So they called it the American Turtle because it looks like a turtle when it floats in the water when you view it from the top. But turtle was not a very threatening name, and except when you think of its inventor, David Bushnell, saying that his turtle snapped on command. So the turtle more than snapped. It was invented to secretly submerge under a British warship and attach a bomb to its hull, then escape while the fuse burned and the clock ticked down until boom. So David Bushnell was a Yale graduate. He invented the turtle in 1775, but he first invented waterproof gunpowder. And he needed a way to deliver it, to blow up a British ship. Back in the early days, if you wanted to blow up a ship, or you would set it on fire. So you would take hot oil on a rag and you would set it on fire and you get it onto the other ship somehow and hope that the hull or the sides caught on fire. Bushnell was a genius, and he invented waterproof explosives. The governor of Connecticut, where Bushnell lived, who was a patriot, he knew about the invention. He recommended it to General Washington. Excuse me, even though Washington was skeptical, he invested funds for its continued creation. The American Turtle submarine, if you look at the picture here, it had ballast, it had pumps, it had this detachable mine, it had rudders. It could go underwater for about 15 to 20 minutes, maybe even longer. It held one man as a pilot. It operated via pumps and hand-cranked propellers. They used tar inside the grooves of the wooden structure to make it waterproof. It could go underwater for about 20 to 30 minutes. It had glass built into its structure to provide sunlight, but once it was submerged, it was dark. And that problem was solved by Bushnell knowing about a fungus that would glow in the dark, kind of like the green on your watch if you have a luminescent watch. And he placed that all around the instruments in the submarine and the gauges, which allowed the operator to see when it was underwater, which was pretty ingenious. That fungus could only work in warm water, so the turtle could not operate in the cold. So it had several missions in the New York Harbor. Missions failed, unfortunately, except for in our story. Patriot Ezra Lee piloted its first mission in New York Harbor, and the target was the HMS Eagle Howe's flagship, stationed off Manhattan. But Lee could not get the bomb to attach to the hull because it hit metal that was underneath the wooden hull. And he tried to connect with another part of the hull, but he was not able to stay underneath because you can imagine all the currents, and he had to give up his mission. But Lee reported that the British spotted him and rode out to investigate. So then, this is pretty interesting, he released a floating bomb, which they saw and avoided in a retreat. But when it exploded, it did so, and this is Lee's quote, with tremendous violence, throwing large columns of water and pieces of wood that composed it high into the air. Lee tried again on a mission a month later, but he was spotted, so he abandoned the mission. And later, the British sunk the American Turtle as it sat in its holding device in Fort Lee. Again, when you tell kids this kind of a story, they're fascinated. And I never heard about this in 1976 during the American Bicentennial. And interestingly enough, the American Turtle was no secret after all. Despite the Continental's attempts to keep the turtle a secret, the British did learn about it, but they didn't take the threat seriously. So what happened was, it seemed a loyalist tavern keeper, which, as you may know, the tavern was also the local post office. He intercepted a Bushnell's letter, and he learned of it, and he sent a coded message to the British attention about it. The message contained some inaccuracies stating it was ready to be used, when in fact it was still being developed in the Connecticut River. So there's the cover of Submarine Secrets and Daring Rescue. And so in our story, it's a continuing adventures of the Clark twins, John and Ambrose. And in this story, they have to replace their brother Bertie, who gets kidnapped by the British. And they have the opportunity to operate the American Turtle submarine, and with the mission of blowing up a British frigate. And it's almost a several adventures in one. They also then have to go on a mission to rescue their brother Bertie, who is at that Fort St. George. I love this about General Washington. This is what he wrote to Thomas Jefferson about the American Turtle. He wrote, "Bushnell is a man of great mechanical powers, fertile of invention, and a master in execution. He came to me in 1776, recommended by Governor Trumbull and other respectable characters who were proselytes to his plan. Although I wanted faith myself, I furnished him with money and other aid to carry it into execution. I then thought, and still think, that it was an effort of genius." And as you know, that's the forerunner of today's submarines. Another quote that we used in Submarine Secrets and the Daring Rescue that actually General Washington said, and I love sharing this with kids as we teach the American Revolution, is labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. And I talk to the kids about what their conscience is and why it's important to keep that alive. Now, on to book 3. Kids have no idea when I say this statement, did you know General Washington had a giant watch chain? A lot of them aren't familiar with what a watch chain is anymore, but it gives me a chance to tell them what a watch chain is and about why General Washington had a giant one, which is the hook for book 3, and which is what completes our trilogy, Links to Liberty, Defending the Great Chain at West Point. So if you're from this area, in the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, a lot of people here have been to West Point for football games. They maybe have seen the chain. They don't know a lot about it. People in other parts of the country have no idea what the Great Chain at West Point is. But its mission was to prevent the British from taking control of the Hudson River and splitting the American colonies. Because if the British controlled the river, they'd have the ability to launch a major invasion from Canada and cut New England off from the middle and southern colonies. So the Patriots decided to create this giant train that they would drape across the Hudson River, right near West Point, right where the river bends. And it's so difficult for a sailing ship, to make that curve around the bend. So they created this giant chain. You can see a picture of it there. Those are 13 remaining links that are at West Point. Each link is 2 feet long, and 1,200 large iron links made up this chain. Each weighed from 100 to 180 pounds. And it took 40 men 4 days to install it. Again, when kids hear about this, they're just fascinated by the creativity behind this and the fact that people actually did this, right? So how does this chain go across the river? It's supported by a bridge of waterproof logs, like rafts that stretched across the river. There was a clever system of pulleys and rollers and ropes, and midstream there were anchors to adjust the tension to overcome currents and tides. So when you explain this to children, they're also fascinated that this could happen during colonial times as well, and that people made this huge effort to stop the British from going up this river. Chain ran across the Hudson West Point to Constitution Island. The idea was, what if a ship tried to ram it? Well, the chain would hold and destroy the hull of the ship. And it was never challenged by the British here at West Point. I love this picture. This is Links to Liberty, defending the Great Chain at West Point, actually touching the Great Chain at West Point. I want to thank Professor Robert McDonald at West Point for taking that picture and sending it to me. There's my dad and I at age 95. My dad has the privilege and honor of becoming a published author again with me with this third book in our series. And there aren't too many 95-year-old authors out there. And I have to say, Links to Liberty includes several great ideas that came from my dad. The climax in the story was a brilliant idea that he came up with. My dad wanted there to be a raccoon in the story because he thought kids would like to have an animal. I looked at him like he had 10 heads when he told me this idea, but since Father knows best, I went with his lead, and it really works in the story. And it was such a great honor to do this book series with my dad. So we will stop there. And Roger, do you want to open it up?
That's absolutely terrific. Well, thanks, Rob. It's wonderful to see how you've zoned in on some stories that you can tell children about the American Revolutionary War and get them engaged in our American history, which obviously is something that we all want to be able to do to understand the past. Before I go further, I'm looking at your father's SAR shirt there. I think
Yes.
Notice that I'm also wearing one of my SAR shirts as well. And in a few minutes, we're going to ask one of our guests, Colleen Wilson, who is with the Education Center of the Sons of the American Revolution, to join us to tell us about some resources available for parents and teachers. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you some questions, Rob.
Sure. Do you want me to, before you start, do you want me to stop sharing my screen? Or?
Yeah, let's end the share screen there. Okay. I can actually do that. So there we go. Okay. So what I wanted to ask you, Rob, is that given the current climate of what's going on these days in the media, what are our challenges to teaching American history for children, and particularly with the Revolutionary War period? What do you say to educators and school children about our history?
Yeah, well, I think the challenge is making it relevant, right? Making it interesting, making it exciting for kids to want to learn more about it. And the way that, that's the reason we wrote these books, is because we wanted to nurture patriotism. I try to do with my kids growing up. Most of my friends are very patriotic. I guess you kind of tend to run in tight circles, right? But there's lots of people that I meet that they're losing their patriotism, and you see that with youth today. And by putting characters in an adventure setting and having history with fiction, that's what we tried to do with these books. And then fortunately there were all these great feats of creativity that lent themselves to great storytelling, hopefully, which is what we tried to do.
So patriotism, you mentioned patriotism a few times. I mean, patriotism is going to mean different things to different people. And how do you define patriotism?
Yeah, so I would define patriotism as love for country, love of country, and the willingness to serve others in your country. Not necessarily always having to be to fight for your country, but if you're called upon, you would hope that a patriotic spirit would prompt someone to say, yeah, I'm going to go fight for my country. I believe in freedom and liberty. As you see in the headlines now, we're heading toward possibly socialism, which, I learned in middle school social studies that it was a failed attempt and never worked for anybody that's ever tried it, and only caused pain and suffering for people. Now there's a whole slew of people that want to bring that into our nation. So, we need true patriots. We need true spirit of patriotism in our youth and even young adults. And
well, I think certainly, I think we can probably all agree that part of the idea of our founding really was the celebration of different ideas, for sure. So what kind of resources do you have available for parents and educators?
yes, that's a great question. So I spent a lot of time working with educators, and we created study guides to go along with each book. They're very comprehensive. They have great ideas to help teachers to teach the American Revolution in their classroom. Again, these were done with educators who are very creative, who are very passionate about history. And the ideas they're not just a few, there's a ton of them. So these study guides are available on my website, robertskeed.com, under the study guide icon. And we're doing all we can to promote these study guides to educators, homeschoolers as well, who have already shown a great interest in these stories.
So I think this is a good time, if I could just take a little bit of an interlude, Rob, if you will allow me to invite Colleen Wilson to join us. Colleen, as I mentioned earlier, is the director of the Education Center of the Sons of the American Revolution. And we're going to talk a little bit about educator resources. Colleen, welcome.
Well, hello, how are you? I'd like to share with you our latest resources, and that would be our education.sar.org. If you go to the SAR site, and you're going to see there when you are logging in, and if you click on the education part right there, you just click on that, the top bar, and you're going to see our new education website. And this site, when you look along the top bar, you're going to see some choices: lessons, keyholes to history, artifacts, speaking out about history, and our youth awards, and some of our media opportunities, which include an ebook, which is Long May She Wave, Our Flag, History and Etiquette. So we offer that now to everyone, both in hard form and then also with the electronic ebook. And some of the things I'd like to highlight, I want to thank Robert for all he's doing to bring these exciting stories into the classroom and getting the students hooked on history. I don't think it takes much. When you really tell them the good stories, and they're not stories, but when you really relay the actual history of our country, it's fascinating, and they do want to learn more. And so with our keyholes to history, we have added an additional 60 units there, 1 minute, and the students can listen to them. They can choose which ones. The teacher, it's by, time period, and also, you can see the different topics when you go through. And so they're, like I said, 1 minute. And what's good about this new system is that you can download it right from there or just listen to it. And so it's all timed around the same time in that period. So if a teacher said, we wanted you to learn more about 1774, you would have options in that regards. Some of the ones we included are George Washington's Native American name, Canto Canteris, and the students are always very interested in that. And there's just a whole number of ones that we used. We also wanted to show some diversity, so we have included a variety of topics and expanded upon others. So I encourage you to take the time to look through that. We've got women, and all of the narration is also professionally done, and it's done with people that are reflecting that time period. If it's about African Americans, we're using those individuals. We're using young people, one as young as 14 that did the recordings, and us older individuals. So you'll get a whole range. And what we wanted you to experience in those keyholes is that these are the sounds and the accents and the pronunciations of words that colonists would have heard at that time. People, they heard French, they heard the British accent. I mean, we have a proclamation of 1763 that will knock your socks off. It is by a man in Cambridge who does that. And it's the best one I think I've heard, but I am prejudiced. So, so check that out. The other thing that I would like to bring to your attention is our Speaking Out About History. This is a piece that, and really kudos to Roger for helping us make this such a success. And we have gone through and we are offering recorded pieces. Brooks Lyles, who is on, excuse me, on the call. He is our education chairman at the national level, and he has served as our moderator. And you can listen to these 1-hour edited pieces. And the author takes approximately about 15 minutes to review the book, talks about his resources, but also talks about how he came up with it and what he experienced while writing the book. And we have really picked some great ones, I think. One of the ones too, Valcour Island, who you know, which we sometimes know very little about. Jack Kelly did an outstanding job of making you feel like you were right there witnessing Benedict Arnold on water instead of on land. And so that was really great. And we've had David O. Stewart. So while you're mentioning a lot about Washington, he did a great job about his political rise. And our last one was really a fun one that we think students would really enjoy, and educators. And it's Travels with George Washington by Nathaniel Philbrick. And he just did a great job and even incorporated his dog, Dora. And so I think it's a great way to experience the first presidential trip to learn, you know, the people, the colonies, what they were thinking that George Washington took as our first president. So those are some of the things, and we will be doing a great deal more in that regards. Teachers, students can access this. It can give them ideas for essays. It can give them ideas for the poster contest at the elementary school level. It can give them ideas for oration topics. And, you know, just enough to whet their appetite, and then they can search for additional information. Another area that I'll talk about really quick is the artifact section. The artifact section will rotate. Currently, we have 12 artifacts on display, and those 12 artifacts were selected, and we have a description with them, and they're conversation starters. They are, once again, too, if they need to write a report, if they need an idea, teachers can use that as a, what do you think this is? Everything from showing early technology with the quadrant to, you know, what do we use today? Just had a flat tire tonight. I could have used that wheel jack. That would have been helpful, just as it was years ago. So what we do, though, is we take this another step, and we use inquiry-based learning, and we've developed a activity discovery worksheet. So the students are going to go through, and the students lead the discussion. So it's not an individual where we are saying, what is this? We have the student, okay, tell me about this. And it may be the first time they look at it, but Okay, I guess I see that it's large, it's heavy, what color it is, what we think it's made out of. So that's another really great thing that we could share with educators, and we look forward to doing it. You'll see there's a lesson unit, which we will be building upon. The one that we're featuring right now on the American Revolution, the causes, and that is from the University of Michigan Education Department. And so that is on there, and we'll be growing that with a number of other collaborations. So we're offering a wide array of different pieces, and I invite you to spend some time, enjoy yourself, looking at all of the different resources. And if you have questions, you want more information, there is so much more we want to put on there, and we will as time allows. So thank you, Roger, for letting us talk about this evening. Yeah, you're muted.
Yep, there we go. So thank you, Colleen. And I wanted to let everyone know I saw Colleen was on the call, so she just did all of that on the fly. I asked her to join us. So I thank you, Colleen, for giving us those resources. But this is exactly what Rob has been doing as an author. And Rob, Rob has been going into schools, as I mentioned earlier. Rob, tell us about how you approach a school and what your when you email schools, you tell them that you have these books that you want to talk about. Tell us how that process works and what kind of reception you get.
Yeah, so typically I reach out to librarians or the PTO representatives, and I do it via email mostly. And I have a pitch letter, as you can imagine, and it really stresses those points that I mentioned to you earlier. Kind of the goal is to really nurture patriotism, celebrate the creativity of colonial patriots, the leadership of General George Washington, and inspire kids to do great things. And when I say kids, I mean big kids like us on this call too. I mean, the books are really for patriots ages 9 and up. So you can be an adult, you could be a teacher and read these stories and feel like they're, Tom Clancy novels written for kids and adults. So, that's kind of the goal. And
so, I don't want to turn this whole program into an advertisement for the Sons of the American Revolution, but obviously that is the mission of the Sons of the American Revolution. You've been a member, and Colleen is the director of the Education Center, and I am on Brooks Lyle's Education Committee. I wanted to let you know that from time to time I talk to other members of the Sons of the American Revolution, and they've talked about what it is about getting into schools. One of our listeners on this program is a fellow by the name of Wayne Snodgrass, and Wayne works very hard on a program called Patriot Chest, which for those of us in New Jersey who drive from town to town, and we've got Revolutionary War sites all over the place. Well, out in the Western states, they don't necessarily have Revolutionary War sites, and Wayne and some of his colleagues have put together a marvelous program, Patriots Chest, with some artifacts that they bring from school to school. But one of the things that I would like to recommend to the Sons of the American Revolution is that we put together book lists of books like Rob Skeed's and some of Anne Rinaldi's books. Anne Rinaldi has written some wonderful books for young readers. There are some terrific books out there on the American Revolution. And I think that, as Rob has mentioned, his initial approach is to librarians and to the parent-teacher organizations. And I think that this is a nice way of our being able to offer something to different schools and to our state societies, so that we can work more on our mission about getting kids excited about our own history. So let's see, I have a question here from Brooks. Brooks, I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'm going to bring you on the screen here. If that's okay with you, I'm going to, if you can unmute yourself, that would be terrific.
Sure.
What's your thought?
Hey, Brooks.
Robert, I really enjoyed your presentation, and as a grandfather of a 11-year-old and a 3-year-old, I'm always looking for things like the series. And we have, you're a compatriot, your father's a compatriot. Jeff Baggett of Kentucky Society has written a 5-set series of history books for young kids, which I just bought a set of for my grandson for Christmas. But these are the kind of things, like Roger was saying, that beyond the initial thing, which would be to maybe put together some recommended reading lists that are age group focused to share on our site. But eventually, I'd like to know what it would take to, through your distribution network, to carry your books on the SAR merchandise store, or eventually in our retail store that's going to go with will be in the front edge of the museum at the headquarters in Louisville.
We can certainly talk about that. At the risk of crossing any ethical boundaries, I publish Rob Skeed's books. And obviously, I like to be able to sell Rob Skeed's books. But that's something I have to be a little careful about. I'm in the business of education. I'm in the business of book publishing. But as Colleen knows well, I like to be able to get authors out there, because I think authors excite kids. I think authors excite readers. And the more we can do to excite readers, whether it's books for young readers or books for adults, I think that this is a way that we can open discussions and have conversations about our history. So I think that's I think it's certainly something worth talking about. Rob, what surprises you the most when you do these school programs with kids? I mean, we keep hearing, well, they're not teaching history in the schools, but the kids seem so excited. Tell us what surprises you about these school visits that you do.
Yeah, so what surprises me, and it's the teachers are teaching the curriculum, right? So it's not that teachers are doing a bad job or they're bad teachers. It's just that the curriculum doesn't include a lot of things that are exciting. And again, I'm not saying that, the Cobra Spiring and the American Control Submarine and the Great Chain at West Point are the only things that are exciting about the American Revolution, because it's not. But, history can be boring if it's not taught in an exciting way, right? And there's so much more, even than those 3 things about the American Revolution, that are interesting and exciting. When I was a kid, it was the bicentennial that drew me in, because everything in 1976, when I was in 6th grade, was about the bicentennial. We have another monumental date milestone coming up, right? So hopefully the American Revolution will be again in school, a predominant everyday kind of thing that they're going to talk about for that year. But what surprises me is how little they know, and then when you start telling them, how interested and exciting they get. Like Colleen said, it doesn't take much. Once they start hearing about it and learning about freedom and liberty, and that we didn't have that, we didn't have that, and people fought for it, and they get enthralled with it, just like I did.
That's excellent. Well, I think what I'm going to do is I think we've got some follow-up notes from this program for sure. I want to thank Brooks Lyles and Colleen Wilson for joining us impromptu on our program this evening. So I'm gonna unspotlight the 2 of you if I could. but with my thanks for sure. And I wanted to thank Rob for bringing us news about his books for middle grade books for young readers. You can find more about Rob's books at robertskeed.com. I got that right, Rob? Right?
Yep.
Rob? Obviously, I've read them all. They're wonderful reads, not just for kids. I got to tell you, as much as these are written with young kids as protagonists, these are just wonderful stories, and you learn as you read the book. So I certainly think that it's well worth taking a look at and reading Rob's books. Coming up on, so Rob, I want to thank you very much for your presentation tonight.
Thank you.
And remind everybody that this is being taped. This will be on historyauthortalks.com. So you can certainly go to History Author Talks and learn more about some of the other History Author Talks that we've had in the past. On Tuesday, December 7th, we're going back to an adult title now. Our guest is going to be Woody Holton. Woody is a professor of history at the University of South Carolina, who's just published a book called Liberty is Sweet: The Hidden History of the American Revolution. Woody's book is another good narrative, different narrative on the American Revolution, but he also really folds in the history of the revolution that includes African Americans, enslaved peoples, the indigenous peoples, the Indian nations, and women's role during the American Revolution. So obviously all timely topics. We're then going to take a few weeks off because, as I mentioned, I'm going to be doing my tours during the 10 Crucial Days. Starting up in January, on January 11th, we have Professor Cole Jones, a professor of history at Purdue University, whose book Captives of Liberty, Prisoners of War, and the Politics of Vengeance in the American Revolution is a tremendous, tremendous read. And then in January 18th, we have Don Haggist, who's written a book called These Distinguished Corps, the British Grenadier and the Light Infantry Battalions in the American Revolution. So we've got some really terrific programs coming up. And again, I want to thank not only Robert Skeed and his dad, who wrote these wonderful books, but I thank Colleen Wilson and Brooks Lyles from the Sons of the American Revolution for contributing to our program this evening. And I look forward to seeing you next week, Tuesday, December 7th, actually it'll be at 7:30. We've had to change the time just a little bit so that Woody Holton can visit his grandson's violin program. So it's at 7:30 next week. We'll see you then for Liberty is Sweet. And thank you very much, everybody, and have a nice evening. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.